Xirtus.
Hackers are a grave threat to the national security. This incident just proves, without a doubt, that we need increased funding to stop.
Hold on, I'm getting interference.
Hola, boys and girls.
So a lot of people are getting out of quarantine now. And I thought about a friend of mine who recently passed away, Ben Kelly, whom they've decided to name May 21st, Ben Kelly Day in Santa Cruz. Ben Kelly was a cool kid who was a few years younger than me. He was really into surfing, pretty sober-minded guy, helped out a lot of kids. And he spent the whole time in quarantine, waited to the first day to go surfing, and he was killed by a shark. So what's that about? Not really sure. Especially because he was a Christian and he believed in so many things and was such a good person. Don't really have an answer for you, but this episode is dedicated to Ben Kelly. Love you, buddy.
Come on, Barbie. Let's go party.
I'm a Barbie girl in the Barbie world. Life in plastic is fantastic.
Let's begin, shall we? But first, Cherry Progressive Mandelbrot set is in motion. Echo Choir has been breached. Cherry Progressive Mandelbrot set is in motion. Echo Choir has been breached. Cherry Progressive Mandelbrot set is in motion. Echo Choir has been breached. No? Nothing? Just checking. So I got in a fight recently. So I got in a sort of debate recently, maybe an argument rather, about democracy and my criticisms of democracy, as well as the actual definition of things that people confuse with democracy, which are really the foundations of governance, like forums, which were the Roman marketplaces, where people were allowed to freely exchange goods, services, and ideas, eventually which allowed for the consul and the Senate. And the Senate was a collection of men from age 30 on, considered the elder men, and there was a hierarchy. Eventually they thought, wouldn't it be better if there was some sort of a free horizontal discourse? This makes a certain amount of sense in certain circumstances that you would want popularism, but that's all it is, and it's important to remember that a democracy is a mechanism for popularism. That is to say, on Facebook, if someone's having a debate and some sort of discussion, which is a form of sophism, then that forum, which could be a selective number of people or it could be a participant by anyone, that forum can decide either for themselves what they believe to be true, or they could submit to whomever had the most likes. And this is the big problem with a democracy. In a debate, imagine in a debate, if at the end of the debate, whomever lost, either because they didn't wear enough makeup, or they weren't funny enough, or some of their points weren't well enough presented, or maybe some of their points were inaccurate but others were not. If that person loses the debate in front of an audience and the audience decides that the other person wins, should that person be forced to agree, to submit to the other's will? That is the true difference between self-determination and democracy. We can have discussions, we can have exchange of ideas and goods and services without there being restrictions based on redistribution by an authoritarian governance system. My criticism of democracy is grounded in democracy's purposes and the process and outcome. Since classical antiquity and through the modern era, democracy has been associated with the rule of the people, rule of the majority, and free selection or election either through direct participation or elected representation, respectively, but has not been linked really to any particular outcome. Political thinkers approach the critiques of democracy from different perspectives. Many do not necessarily oppose democracy, rule of the people, but rather seek to expand the questions of the popular definition. It is very common for people to say, well, there's no example, but there are many examples. The problem is people say, well, they're not perfectly educated, but then what is truth? Let's say you have a discussion between a well-educated populace and there's a discussion about whether to use wind turbines or solar panels on a field. Everyone's well-educated, everyone knows that both things are good for the environment, but is it a decision that should be decided by popularism? Perhaps the field would be better suited because of where it's located for wind or for sunlight. Perhaps one answer is actually more correct than the other. Perhaps there should not be a popularist lottery for every decision. And at this point, democracy becomes less about governance and more about psychological manipulation and civil morale. Whether or not we submit becomes less valuable to whether or not we agree. And eagerly agree at that. It has been said that democracy is the worst form of governance, and I'm not the first critic. Some of the more famous critics of democracy through history include Plato, the authors of the Federalist Papers, Aristotle, Montague, James Harrington, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Martin Heidegger, Hubert Lagardelle, Friedrich Nietzsche, Ayn Rand, etc.
You can brush my hair and dress me everywhere.
Imagination. Life is your creation.
Common party, Exco party.
Robert Michels, who developed the mainstream political science theory of iron law of oligarchy in 1911, argued that the oligarchy is inevitable as an iron law within any organization as part of the tactical and technical necessities of organization on the topic of democracy. It is an organization which gives birth to the dominion of the elected over the electors, of the mandataries over the mandators, of the delegates over the delegators. Plato's Republic presents a critical view of democracy through the narration of Socrates, which is a charming form of government, full of variety and disorder, and dispensing a sort of equality to equals and unequaled alike. In his work, Plato lists 5 forms of government from the best to worst. Assuming that the Republic was intended to be a serious critique of political thoughts in Athens, Plato argues that only Callipolis, an aristocracy led by the unwilling philosopher kings, the wisest men, is the just form of government. Plato also rejected Athenian democracy on the basis that such democracies were anarchistic societies, and that they followed citizens' impulses rather than pursuing the common good. That is, rather than pursuing some abstract truth. How many people do you know? How many of them are truth seekers? How many of them are popularists? What percent to what ratio? It seems like there are more normatives than there are exceptions to the rule. The oligarchs or merchants of the forum are unable to wield their power effectively, and the people take over, electing someone who plays on their wishes, for example by throwing lavish festivals. However, the government grants the people too much freedom, and the state degenerates into the 4th form, tyranny and mob rule, where all rights are removed, where all rights are up to question. The Latin phrase refers to majoritarianism as mobile vulgus, the fickle crowd. This is the major downfall to democracy. Majoritarianism is the traditional political philosophy that asserts the agenda of the majority categorized by a religion, language, or social class, or some other identifying factor of the population being entitled to a certain degree of primacy in the society and having the right to make decisions that affect the society at large. Majoritarianism is a retraction against the right of self-determination and the primary mechanism of democracy, that is to say, hierarchy of the mob and submission of the individual. Another pejorative for majoritarianism or despotic democratic dictatorship is ochlocracy, or the tyranny of the majority. Ochlocracy refers to the governance by a mob or mass of people via intimidation of legitimate authorities, but it can easily be used to describe a society that is controlled by their desires, as well as their dreams, not only their nightmares. An ancient fallacy that was discovered about democracy is Arrow's impossibility theorem, otherwise known as Arrow's paradox. States that when voters have three or more distinctive alternatives, no ranked voting electoral system can convert the ranked preferences of individuals into community-wide, complete, and transitive ranking, while also meeting a specific set of criteria: unrestricted domain, non-dictatorship, Pareto efficiency, referring to a situation that cannot be modified so as to make anyone or individual or preference criterion better off without making at least one individual or preference criterion worse off, and independence of irrelevant alternatives. Kenneth Arrow said, if every voter prefers alternative X over alternative Y, then the group prefers X over Y. If every voter's preference between X and Y remains unchanged, then the group's preference between X and Y will also remain unchanged, even if voters' preference between other pairs like X and Z, Y and Z, or Z and W change. There is no dictator. No single voter possesses the power to always determine the group's preference. Arrow's theorem says that if the decision-making body has at least 2 or 3 members with at least 3 options deciding amongst them, then it is impossible to design a social welfare function that satisfies all these conditions, assumed to be reasonable requirement of a fair electoral system at one point. And this exemplifies a major argument against democracy, the benefits of a specialized society. One argument against equity is that the benefits of a specialized society may be compromised by democracy. As ordinary citizens are encouraged to take part in their political life of the country, they have the power to directly influence the outcome of governmental policies through the democratic procedures of voting, campaigning, and the use of press. The result is that their government policies may be more influenced by non-specialist opinions, and thereby the effectiveness compromised, especially if a policy is very technically sophisticated or the general public inadequately informed. Even if they are, some have argued that this should not even be the goal of democracies, because the minority could be seriously mistreated under this purported goal. So where do I stand on the concept? Well, the resulting consequences of democracy are unforgivable, transgressions against human rights, and the foundations of democracy, that is to say, its ancestors, free discourse in forum, are likely to renounce democracy as their bastard. This free discourse in forum, this conversation that can be had where contracts are able to be exchanged, freedom of exchange between property, services, and ideas, education, economy, and forum, Senate, these facets of discussion for finding out information that's valuable. Information that one is self-determinate to pick and choose as they will, to subscribe to and ascribe their own lives about. These individual rights, this form of agency, that is what matters, at least to me.
Hi, Barbie.
Hey, Ken.
Wanna go for a ride?
Sure, Ken.
Come.
I'm a Barbie girl in the Barbie world. Life in plastic, it's fantastic. You can brush my hair and dress me everywhere.
Imagination. Life is your creation.
Come on, Barbie. Let's go party.
I'm a Barbie girl in the Barbie world.
But if you have time, you should probably check out that movie, American Ultra, a pretty interesting film about the radicalization of every American citizen. Beyond MKULTRA, and more successful than any other Ultra program, American Ultra. And this is really why I want to make this series on sci-fi, but the essential subtext is that everyone is in the MKUltra program, or some Ultra program, and if you don't know what that is, Google MKUltra. but I kind of get the feeling that a lot of you do. To some extent, at least the idea that the government toyed with every toy they had, including mind control, but a lot of people seem to think this program just sort of stopped, and I would argue the opposite, rather that it was so successful they no longer needed one-on-one tutorage to make it work, and eventually it wasn't just special people anymore who were part of the program, it's more like everybody. And it's this fascinating field of psychological frequencies and automation which made it possible to make not just celebrities, but even your mom, sister, brother, and dad, and maybe even yourself, probably, that made you capable of being a secret agent.
It only takes a careless moment to turn this into this.
A free agent or agent of change. Now really quickly, let's go over a few quick definitions, and these aren't the best definitions, but they're legal ones, so they'll do. Agency, the capacity, condition, or state of acting or of exerting power. Operation, a person or thing through which power is exerted or an end is achieved. See instrumentality. So having agency is having the condition or state of capacity for operation. What operation? Which operation may depend. Well, then let's think about freedom, eh? So freedom is liberation from slavery or restraint, or from the power of another. See independence. Now, this is a surprisingly fun one. Change in law means the adoption of any law or rule, regulation, or treaty after the closing date of any agreement. Any change in law or rule, regulation, or treaty, or in the interpretation or application thereof by any government authority after the closing date of said agreement. Now, with the new task forces, many of the old ways of life and agendas and ideals of the antique agents of Operation Cancelled still seem to float around. And so today you're going to hear a little bit more about free agents and agents of change, as they're referred to in Washington. And I think this is just sort of the CIA's Trekkies versus Trekkers argument. How nerdy of a mind control victim are you, and where exactly do your loyalties lie, and how exactly cool are they? So this, in a lot of ways, is the story of not just they, you, or me, but of every American. And indeed, at this point, it's starting to seem like the whole wide, televised, mass-programmed world. But before you get too worried that you might have been secretly hypnotized into knowing Kung Fu, let me try to optimistically calm you down with the consolation that knowing Kung Fu is actually pretty useful if you can just take control of your own mind. If there's one positive thing to remember, it's that the use of a mind is a terrible thing to waste. Well, let's spiral off for a while, shall we? So Douglas Adams once said, "Isn't it enough to see that a garden is beautiful without having to believe that there are fairies at the bottom of it too?" He also said, "I love deadlines. I love the whooshing noise they make as they go by." For such a nihilist, having first laid some cynicism, he also said, "I know that astrology is not a science. Of course it's not. It's just an arbitrary set of rules like chess or tennis. The rules just kind of got there. They don't make any kind of sense except in terms of themselves. But when you start to exercise those rules, all sorts of processes start to happen, and you start to find out all sorts of stuff about people. In astrology, the rules happen to be about stars and planets, but they could have been about ducks and drakes for all the difference it would make. It's just a way of thinking about a problem, which lets the shape of that problem begin to emerge. The more rules, the tinier the rules. The more arbitrary they are, the better they are. By the way, the new season of DuckTales is about to begin. So hopefully you all still have some time off from work predicting the future. And we're going to continue with the Dilbert example for whatever reason. Dilbert is the epitome of the 1990s beige computer San Jose, Silicon Valley programmer. working for companies that are constantly swallowed by other companies, where the basic technology they've been using has been the same since the 70s. In fact, the first episode of Dilbert in the mid-90s shows him with all sorts of automations that Alexa and Google and Siri have yet to become efficient of themselves. But Dilbert's home system accidentally runs his bath too hot once, and he decides to never automate unnecessary tasks ever again. Dilbert's idea, if you want something done right, do it yourself. Whereas Dogbert's model is, if you want something done, get someone else to do it. And this leads into the essential metaphor of Wall-E. Wall-E basically does nothing and works every day holding up all of his sick days so that eventually he can retire early, something that no one's mentioned to him doesn't really work. But in general, he gets away with not doing anything because at some point he did everything that started the company. It was sometime in the 1970s that Wall-E did the last thing he ever did, which was to build the automated system, which is taking care of everything all the way up to the date when they finally have to start reprogramming things 30 years later in the 1990s. In the late 1990s, right before Y2K. You might actually be surprised how many pieces of software can last for 30 years at a time. How many systems around the world of Navy boats and McDonald's still run off of SCO and BSD? And COBOL. In New Jersey, they recently had a problem where they weren't able to update their computer systems because no one knew how to program in the antiquated language of COBOL. At this point, we're starting to need remote viewers to go into code and to start to see what the programmer was thinking at the time that they created this nonsensical code. Some sorts of Silicon Valley existential detectives will use particular brands of coffees, cigarettes, etc. in order to try to bring up the memory through odors. Seriously, this is how serious this has gotten. In the future, people, please try to be more meticulous about your coding. Anyway, just a personal trigger of mine. But this is an interesting point about automation and how far back automation's gone. Because really, this is the point when Wall-E didn't have to go to work ever again because everything was done by him. One day, it changed the world. And now he just needs to sit back and wait for the world to catch up with him. Something that's taken decades. And he's learned to live with it and how to communicate that jazz to his completely nebbish employers. But also with it comes his complete lack of interest in doing anything ever again. After this, he just likes to sit around. This becomes a major problem in the future when Wall-E's not interested in doing anything or learning anything ever again. The kind of problems that Dilbert's trying to face himself. And indeed, finally, it seems like everyone. What becomes the purpose of self-betterment in a society where everything is automated? Where all jobs are done, and all machines smarter than man, and when continual growth is no longer necessary at that point and perhaps dangerous to the sustainability of the system that's been created. Where do we go from here? Well, another quote from Douglas Adams, "I may not have gone where I intended to go, but I think I have ended up where I intended to be." In other words, keep on trucking. And there's a good example from the Dilbert cartoon again, where the people of Albonia who live in mud and are used to outsource manufacturing of the ubiquitous technological products of their company, the Gruntmaster 6000, which requires genetically modified microchips made of cow trees, which are grown in some sort of Tartarian mud-flooded land, which had once been a technological wonder, but is now covered in mud. Yeah, seriously. And the irony being that at some point in Y2K, when all the technology comes crashing down, the rest of Silicon Valley will start to look like Albonia and Tartaria as well. Lacking technology, covered in mud, people, Luddites, worshipping the mud. In fact, eventually Wall-E becomes a prophet of the Y2K mud flood. And it seems to suggest that so quickly, without our technology, we would devolve right back into Albonia, a land where everyone is up to their knees in mud. The men and women have beards, and budgeted as the bottom line dollar cheapest place to outsource your tech due to their cut rate sweatshops. This could be the future of Silicon Valley. And if you have time to read a book, and if you're still interested, definitely watch the Dilbert cartoon and check out Scott Adams' book, God's Debris, A Thought Experiment. Pretty much one of the best books in the last 100 years on monadism and existentialism in general. Pretty deep and pretty funny. And again, it's just so surprising that something so truthful could make its way into Hollywood. After all, some might say that Hollywood has an agenda. Whether or not they refer to themselves as agents of change or agents of freedom, whatever kinds of agencies exist in Hollywood, there's long been accusations that Hollywood has been run by a group of people that have been trying to take over the world. Of a clandestine elite cabal in Hollywood with the intentions of changing the destiny of America and every American citizen and perhaps the world, breeding grounds for for some of the greatest of the world's propaganda. And though this theory has evolved from the time that Myron Fagan first brought it up, it had a lot to do with elitist, esoteric, and occult control over the easily manipulatable, economically disheartened, and experienced in hardship people. Laymen and field workers, train-traveling fruit pickers, and hobos. A number of not politically motivated, nor necessarily aware, victims themselves of propaganda, who, as Reagan put it, traded the soup kitchen of the welfare state for their freedom, a freedom you could probably trade for more. But around the world, this had become a popular mode of thought in the 19th century and into the 20th century. It was completely acceptable. Socialism was in every university, in all the media. It was in California, in Maine, Connecticut. It was definitely in New York City, and even across the Rust Belt and under Dixieland. Socialism was finding its way into the South. Already across South America, there were a number of Bolivarian republics which would consider themselves on the forefront of socialism. There were even right-wing versions that were openly so, which are the ones that seem to still exist today. Usually socialist democracies or monarchies. Interesting how that worked out. But at the time, there were also a number of intellectuals who were isolated from reality. I mean, clearly, right? These were the atomic spies who lived underground. They did not know what was really going on in the streets. But it makes sense that if everyone had access to the information that they had, the world would be a lot cooler, especially if everyone was as good and noble as they were. And that's as if to say that these were not necessarily communists who wanted to destroy America, but wanted to build a new world. Sound familiar? Everyone wanted to build a new world at the same time, and not everyone was getting along. It would be a disservice to either capitalism or communism to describe them in the ways that they were described at the time, as if those were literal. The realities of either are very different from the way they were both presented. In a technocratic state, for instance, where automation and artificial intelligence has made surplus, and the amount of obligated human labor falls to nearly zero, Marxism serves as more of a managerial, authoritarian control mechanism to keep people safe from hurting each other. In this circumstance, the poor are not allowed to be poor or live in poverty because the rich do not want their children to fall into the same potholes in the roads that the poor have when they play with them, nor do they want them to play with the poor at all. Under this circumstance, property, the human being, is refined as a resource and specialized into whatever sort of useful or amusing uses that can be found for them by the state. Resources are divvied up each according to their needs, and their needs are decided by the state, depending on what the state wants in terms of growth. If growth is not desired, then it is sacrificed in order to sustain or change the state as a whole. Whereas, in full anarcho-capitalism, eventually people start to build casinos that are run by their mobs, and everyone is underneath private security, and it becomes a state anyway. And the security inside Disneyland or the casinos is not any better than in the Soviet Union. Everyone's under camera, everyone's observed, everyone is being game-stalked, assessed for their values and their potential threats in the casino. And the system is sure to game them. Yes, it's true, with access to resources, one can gain resources quicker. It's almost as if they do that on purpose, right? They give you a generation of growth where everyone can make some money with slightly lower taxes, and then they put in a more liberal government that socializes the wealth that's been accumulated for a generation and lose all the wealth, and then they return to another more conserving government generation by generation by generation, ceding just a little bit of the wealth that they've stolen into the hands of the new, so they themselves can achieve some sort of simple goals like a 1 or 2 but never 3-story house, and the majority of the wealth they make can be owned by the state economy. It's an almost perfect system that Myron Fagan, Barry Goldwater, and Ronald Reagan actually may have been onto something about.
Those who would trade our freedom for the soup kitchen of the welfare state have told us they have a utopian solution of peace without victory. They call their policy accommodation. And they say if we'll only avoid any direct confrontation with the enemy, he'll forget his evil ways and learn to love us. All who oppose them are indicted as warmongers. They say we offer simple answers to complex problems. Well, perhaps there is a simple answer. Not an easy answer, but simple. If you and I have the courage to tell our elected officials that we want our national policy based on what we know in our hearts is morally right, we cannot buy our security, our freedom from the threat of the bomb, by committing an immorality so great as saying to a billion human beings now enslaved behind the Iron Curtain, give up your dreams of freedom, because to save our own skins, we're willing to make a deal with your slave masters. Alexander Hamilton said, a nation which can prefer disgrace to danger is prepared for a master and deserves one. Now let's set the record straight. There's no argument over the choice between peace and war, but there's only one guaranteed way you can have peace, and you can have it in the next second: surrender. Admittedly, there's a risk in any course we follow other than this, but every lesson of history tells us that the greater risk lies in appeasement. And this is the specter our well-meaning liberal friends refuse to face, that their policy of accommodation is appeasement. And it gives no choice between peace and war, only between fight or surrender. If we continue to accommodate, continue to back and retreat, eventually we have to face the final demand, the ultimatum. And what then? When Nikita Khrushchev has told his people he knows what our answer will be. He has told them that we're retreating under the pressure of the Cold War, and someday, when the time comes to deliver the final ultimatum, our surrender will be voluntary, because by that time, we will have been weakened from within spiritually, morally, and economically. He believes this because from our side he's heard voices pleading for peace at any price, or better read than dead, or as one commentator put it, he'd rather live on his knees than die on his feet. And therein lies the road to war, because those voices don't speak for the rest of us. You and I know and do not believe that life is so dear and peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery. If nothing in life is worth dying for, when did this begin? Just in the face of this enemy? Or should Moses have told the children of Israel to live in slavery under the pharaohs? Should Christ have refused the cross? Should the patriots at Concord Bridge have thrown down their guns and refused to fire the shot heard round the world? The martyrs of history were not fools. And our honored dead, who gave their lives to stop the advance of the Nazis, didn't die in vain. Where then is the road to peace? Well, it's a simple answer after all. You and I have the courage to say to our enemies, there is a price we will not pay. There is a point beyond which they must not advance. This is the meaning, in the phrase of Barry Goldwater, peace through strength. Winston Churchill said the destiny of man is not measured by material computations. When great forces are on the move in the world, we learn we're spirits, not animals. And he said there's something going on in time and space and beyond time and space, which, whether we like it or not, spells duty. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.
Now, to be fair, after the crash of 29, people were getting paid worse and worse. Unions were less well represented than ever. As a whole, there were more people getting paid, however. But in certain places, it's true. Not every field worker was paid enough. And I say this mostly because of the Red Scare's ability to take innocent people and put them at the front of the witch hunt. Something that happens over and over again. When there are better people to point out, I mean, there were thousands and thousands of people that were arrested just because they had joined an organization with socialism in the name. That is not good either. This makes it really obvious to take your name off that list if you are a serious member, and to use the ambiguity of the situation to make most of the socialists seem soft. But the evidence was clear that people like Rosenberg were indeed stealing nuclear secrets and other classified military information from labs that they happened to be working at. And they leaked that information, sharing it, and for putting that information in the hands of quote-unquote the people. And you have to remember, this wasn't the people, this was only a small group of people, but still available to the socialized scientists of the age. Knowledge is sorrow, but it is also power. And this act of Rosenberg single-handedly changed the fate of US-led dominance in the 20th century. Something that's often been argued is a good thing because absolute power corrupts. Because perhaps America in the 20th century needed to be left in check. However, in a Cold War, what ends up happening is that they egg each other on. And so in a lot of ways, the Soviet Union gave the precedent, especially through the Red Scare, to continue waging a war on an invisible enemy. or one camouflaged rather, in the faces of the innocent people. Control by the mafia and the communists over unions, such as the teachers' unions, have been quite transparent for just about forever. But as true as I believe that is, a gross statement like that is majorly belying of the truth. That's literally the point. There are a number of innocent good people, but organizations are often co-opted by those in charge and used as human body shields. But the Allies used this to their advantage as well. Forced Soviet states like Poland, Czechoslovakia, North Korea, even Hungary, and China were all considered breeding grounds of dissidents, each one of them major players in the international game of espionage. A lot of these people were just peasants who were convinced by some propaganda they saw. Pretty good propaganda, you have to admit. It's colorful, it's strong, it has the same colors as McDonald's. And if you're a joiner and you feel small and you want to be part of something bigger, it's not so hard to see how socialism can happen. How families, how teachers, how union workers, how field hands could all end up in community marches through Alameda, Rochester, New Haven, Galveston, Chicago, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Detroit, Los Angeles, Seattle. The list goes on. And more these populists, like some sort of Star Trekian Borg, assimilate different people's causes as some sort of human body shield in their surreptitious capture the flag game. But it becomes pretty clear that a big part of the major agents of change within this particular movement share the agenda of disrupting the means of production and collapsing the capitalist model for the economy through a major redistribution of the wealth that's currently held in the hands of a few. This is a very short-sighted model, but some of the socialists have actually figured some things out on how to make this work. I mean, over the generations, there have actually been states that have applied these tactics, and not everybody died, you have to remember. As many blights and starvations as you've heard of, there are success stories that you haven't concerning the People's Republic of China, not only their war crimes, but also their capacity to sustain feeding their population of more than 1.5 billion people is simply awe-inspiring. Both are. And somehow, I can imagine how Emil Fuchs thought that stealing information from working at the Los Alamos National Laboratory where he was working as a theoretical physicist is all some sort of a more complicated plan that relies on fools that may have been foolproof to Fuchs. But another quote from Douglas Adams, "The problem with foolproofing a plan is no one ever foresees exactly how foolish people can actually be." Emil Fuchs was born the son of a Lutheran pastor. Fuchs attended the University of Leipzig, where his father was a professor of theology. He joined the Social Democratic Party of Germany and then was expelled in 1932 when he joined the Communist Party of Germany. He went into hiding after 1933 Reichstag fire and fled to the United Kingdom, where he received his PhD at the University of Bristol under the supervision of Neville Mott, where he then worked from the University of Edinburgh as the assistant to Max Born. He was interned at the Isle of Man and later Canada. He returned in 1941 to Britain to work on the British atomic bomb project, where he began passing the information for the project to the Soviet Union through Ruth Kuczynski, codenamed Sonia, a German communist and a major in the Soviet military intelligence who had worked with Richard Sorge's spy ring in the Far East. In 1943, Fuchs and Perels went to the Columbia University in New York City to work on the Manhattan Project. In August 1944, Fuchs joined the Theoretical Physics Division at the Los Alamos Laboratory, working under Hans Bethe. His chief area of expertise was the problem of implosion necessary for the development of the plutonium bomb. After the war, he returned to the UK and worked at the Atomic Energy Research Establishment at Harwell as the head of the Theoretical Physics Division. But then in 1950, Fuchs confessed he was a spy. A British court sentenced him to 14 years imprisonment and stripped him of his British citizenship. He was released in 1959 after serving 9 years and immigrated to the Democratic Republic of East Germany, where he was elected to the Academy of Sciences and became a member of the Socialist Unity Party of Germany, where he was later appointed deputy director of the Institute for Nuclear Research in Rossendorf. His superior at Los Alamos, Hans Bethe, once said that Klaus Fuchs was the only physicist he knew who truly changed history. Because the head of the Soviet project, Lavrenti Beria, used foreign intelligence to third-party check, rather than giving it directly to scientists as he did not trust information by default, it is unknown whether Fuchs' fission information had a substantial effect. Considering that the pace of the Soviet program was set primarily by the amount of uranium they could procure, it is hard for scholars to accurately judge how much time this saved. According to On a Field of Red, A History of the Comintern, Communist International, by Anthony Cave Brown and Charles B. MacDonald, Fuchs' greatest contribution to the Soviets might have been just disclosing how much uranium could be processed for a bomb. Fuchs gave gold technical information in January 1945 that was acquired only after 2 years of experimentation at a cost of $400 million. Fuchs also disclosed the amount of uranium and plutonium the Americans planned to use. Later archival work by the Soviet physicist Germain Goncharov suggested that while Fuchs' early work did help the Soviet efforts towards hydrogen bomb, it was closer to the final correct solution than anyone recognized at the time, and indeed spurred Soviet research into useful problems that eventually provided the correct answer. Since most of Fuchs' work on the bomb, including a 1946 patent on a particular model of the weapon, are still classified by the United States today, it has been difficult for scholars to fully assess. It has been and still is very difficult for scholars to fully assess the ramifications. In any case, it seems clear that Fuchs could not have just given the Soviets the secret to the hydrogen bomb, but he could help others discover he paved the way. The atomic spy ring coordinators were discovered eventually through the testimony of David Greenglass, the brother-in-law of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. Julius Rosenberg, who had married Greenglass' sister Ethel in 1939, had become an agent for the Soviet Union working with Alexander Feklisov. After the NKVD realized that David Greenglass, Julius's brother-in-law, was working on the Manhattan Project, he was recruited into the spy espionage ring by Ruth at Rosenberg's behest in November 1944 and began to pass nuclear secrets to the USSR via the courier Harry Gold, and more directly, a Soviet official in New York City. On Valentine's Day 1950, the story goes that Ruth, who was pregnant with her second child, came too close to the gas heater in their Lower East Side apartment, and her nightgown caught afire. Greenglass extinguished the blaze. She was taken to Governor Hospital for skin grafts and suffered second-degree burns to the right hand. David Greenglass was already aware that the UK and the US intelligence agencies had discovered Klaus Fuchs, and that through Fuchs' confession that they had found one of his American contacts had been a man named Harry Gold. Gold had passed Fuchs' information on to a Soviet agent performing the role of courier, and Anatoly Yakovlev would then pass the information on to his controllers in the USSR. Through Gold, the FBI's trial led to Greenglass and the Rosenbergs, who had allegedly also used Gold as a courier. When Fuchs was first captured, Julius allegedly gave the Greenglasses $5,000 to finance an escape to Mexico. Instead, they went to the Catskill Mountains in southeastern New York, and used the money to seek legal advice. Greenglass was arrested by the FBI for espionage in June 1950 and quickly implicated Julius Rosenberg. During his subsequent testimonies, Greenglass related in detail the secrets he had passed on to the Soviet Union. He falsely attributed passing the cross-section drawing of the atomic bomb to the Soviets to Julius, as he also acknowledged passing other sketches through Gold. The Atomic Energy Commission decided that the implosion concept could be declassified for the use in trial, and limited all discussion to the weapons used in World War II. Rosenberg's defense attorney Emanuel Bloch attempted to convince the jury that his clients were concerned about the issues of national security, but he failed. Greenglass's testimony later seemed too crude, and in the words of many scientists who examined it, worthless. However, this testimony remained sealed until 1966. He also testified that Rosenberg had stolen and given the Russians a proximity fuse, a fuse that detonates explosive devices automatically when the distance of the target becomes smaller than the predetermined value. In March 1953, 3 months before the Rosenbergs' execution, David Greenglass wrote a letter for his attorney to deliver to President Eisenhower, asking for their sentences to be commuted to prison terms so that they would have an opportunity to confess. He wrote, "If these two die, I shall live the rest of my life with a very dark shadow on my conscience." He described his own testimony as an act of contrition for the wrong I had done my country, my family, and myself, and he explained how he now viewed its consequences. "Here, I had to take the choice of hurting someone dear to me, and I took it deliberately. I could not believe that this would have been the outcome. May God in his mercy change that awful sentence." That same month, he admitted to have stolen a few ounces of uranium-238 from a bomb laboratory at Los Alamos years before, and had tossed it into the East River in the 1950s, after he denied having stolen it. After the death of the Rosenbergs, David Greenglass continued to live out his life just beyond the uranium-238-filled East Side River, on 228th Street in Laurelton, Queens, New York, under an assumed name. David Greenglass died on July 1st, 2014. His death was not publicly announced by his family, and was only discovered on October 14th, 2014, when the New York Times called the nursing home where he had been living under that assumed name. What you might find interesting is to a lot of people, these KGB spies are heroes, and to others villains. And as many of you think it's one way, there are many more that think it's the other. I mean, it gets to a point where it's not even about who's better or who's worse, because if everyone has some problems, it's more about what solutions do we have? What lessons have we learned? And have we learned enough to stop making the same mistakes? And a lot of people are going to think that this is all about the McCarthy trials, but I think the McCarthy trials arrested too many of the wrong people and didn't arrest enough of the right ones. It was far too highly publicized and made it too easy to go underground. The Army McCarthy hearings were a series of hearings held by the United States Senate Subcommittee on Investigations between April and June 1954 to investigate conflicting accusations between the United States Army and U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy. The Army accused Chief Committee Counsel Roy Cohn of pressuring the Army to give preferential treatment to G. David Schein for a former McCarthy aide and friend of Cohn's. McCarthy countercharged that this accusation was made in bad faith, and in retaliation for his recent aggressive investigations of suspected communist security risks to the Army. Today, McCarthyism is known as the practice of making accusations of subversion or treason without proper regard for evidence. This, of course, is the New World Order Google Wiki version of reality. But you have to understand, there is some rationale to this. Through the 1940s and 1950s in the United States, the Second Red Scare, as it was called, was characterized by heightened political repression and a campaign spreading fear of communists, influencing the American institutions, and espionage by Soviet agents living perhaps even in suburbia. President Truman had signed an executive order to screen federal employees for association with organizations deemed totalitarian, fascist, communist, or subversive, or advocating to alter the form of the government of the United States by unconstitutional means. Truman was referring to agents of change. The Korean War started in 1950 and began raising tensions. In a speech in February 1950, Senator McCarthy presented a list of alleged members of the Communist Party working in the State Department, which attracted press attention. During the McCarthy era, hundreds of Americans were accused of being communists or communist sympathizers. They became the subject of aggressive investigations and questioning before government, or even private industry panels, committees, and agencies. School children beat up their school children. And the irony was, a whole lot of these people were not communist. All this did was make people reactionarily interested in communism. In his book, The Bureau, The Secret History of the FBI, journalist Ronald Kessler quoted former FBI agent Robert J. Lamphere, whom participated in all of the FBI's major spy cases during the McCarthy period, as saying that the FBI agents who worked counterintelligence were aghast that FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover supported McCarthy. McCarthyism did all kinds of harm because he was pushing something that very much wasn't so, Lamphere told Kessler. The Venona Project intercepts from United States counterintelligence programs initiated during World War II by the United States Army Signal Intelligence Service, later absorbed by the National Security Agency, which ran from February 1st to 1943 until October 1st, 1980, existed to decrypt the messages transmitted by the intelligence agencies of the Soviet Union, NKVD, and KGB and GRU, and was initiated when the Soviet Union was an ally of the United States. The program continued through the Cold War. The Venona intercepts showed McCarthyism did all kinds of harm because he was pushing something that wasn't so. The Venona intercepts showed that over several decades. There were a lot of spies in the government, but not all of them in the State Department. McCarthy lied about his information and figures. He made charges against people that weren't true. McCarthy harmed the counterintelligence efforts against the Soviet threat because of the revulsion it caused. All along, Hoover was helping him. Some of this resulted in California's Yates versus the United States case, which overturned much of the McCarthy convictions in California and essentially deemed that radical protesting was legal in the First Amendment's eyes so long as it did not pose a clear and present danger. Yates did not rule the Smith Act unconstitutional or overrule the Dennis decision, but Yates limited the application of the act to such a degree that it became nearly unenforceable. The Dennis decision. In 1948, 11 Communist Party leaders were convicted of advocating the violent overthrow of the United States government for the violation of several points of the Smith Act. The Smith Act was enacted in 1940 on June 28th and set up criminal penalties for advocating the overthrow of the United States government by force or violence and required all non-citizens, adult residents, to register with the federal government. In 1940, approximately 215 people were indicted under the legislation of the Smith Act, including alleged communists, anarchists, and fascists. The 1948 Dennis decision had been tested by Communist Party members who had been petitioning for social reforms and claimed that the act violated their First Amendment rights to the freedom of speech and that they served no clear and present danger to the nation. One of the men was Johnny Gates, an American communist businessman best remembered for his failed attempt at liberalization of the Communist Party USA in 1957. The defense attorney deliberately antagonized the judges by making a large number of objections and motions, which led to the numerous bitter engagements between the attorneys and Judge Medina. Out of the chaos, an atmosphere of mutual hostility arose between the judge and the attorneys. Medina came to believe that the defense attorneys were using the trial as an opportunity to publicize communist propaganda, and that they had deliberately disrupted the trial using any means they could. Judge Medina attempted to maintain order by removing defendants who were out of order. On October 14, 1949, after the defense rested their case, the judge gave the jury instructions to guide them to reaching a verdict. After deliberating for 7.5 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts against all 11 defendants. The judge sentenced 10 defendants to 5 years imprisonment and a $10,000 fine each. Yates essentially overturned and made unenforceable the laws from the Smith Act and Dennis decision. Years later in California, in 1957, the Yates case essentially overturned those rulings. Yates did not rule the Smith Act unconstitutional, but Yates limited the application of the act to such a degree that it became nearly unenforceable, and we're living in that world today. The decision was announced on the same day as several other decisions in which communists were on the winning side, including Watkins versus the United States and Sweezy versus New Hampshire. Watkins had argued that the power of the United States Congress is not unlimited in conducting investigations, and that nothing in the United States Constitution gives it authority to expose the private affairs of individuals. John Thomas Watkins, a labor union official from Rock Island, Illinois, was convicted of contempt of Congress, a misdemeanor, for failing to answer questions posed by a member of Congress during the hearing held by a subcommittee, the House of Representatives Committee on Un-American Activities, on April 29, 1954. Watkins was asked to name the people he knew to be members of the Communist Party. Watkins told the subcommittee that he did not wish to answer such questions, and that they were outside the scope of the subject on which he was summoned to testify, and of the committee's jurisdiction. Watkins said, "I am not going to plead the Fifth Amendment, but I refuse to answer certain questions I believe are outside the proper scope of your committee's activities. I will answer my question, which this committee put me to about myself. I will also answer questions about those persons whom I knew to be members of the Communist Party, and whom I believe still are. I will not, however, answer any questions with respect to others with whom I associated with in the past. I do not believe that any law in this country requires me to testify about persons who may in the past have been Communist Party members, or otherwise engaged in Communist Party activity, but who, to my best knowledge and belief, have long since removed themselves from the communist movement. I do not believe that such questions are relevant to the work of this committee, nor do I believe that this committee has the right to undertake the public exposure of persons because of their past activities. I may be wrong, and the committee may have this power, but until and unless a court of law so holds and directs me to answer, I most firmly refuse to discuss the political activities of my past associates." And just like that, California became the epicenter. And it's important to note that California isn't one way and hasn't always been this way. I mean, if you've ever been to Bakersfield, you'll see there's a whole other side of California. But admittedly, California is one of the breeding grounds for the red diaper baby, a term that describes a generation of leftward Americans, kinda like Canada, filled with agents of change, following propaganda to a fault, kinda like Canada. And in this land, instead of Eisenhower, we had Adlai Stevenson, a member of the Democratic Party, served on the Committee for the United Nations. In both 1952 and 1956, Stevenson unsuccessfully sought the Democratic presidential nomination. In 1952 and 1956, Stevenson was defeated in landslides by Dwight D. Eisenhower. He tried again in 1960, but unsuccessfully sought the Democratic presidential nomination for the third time. This time, the Democrats chose John F. Kennedy, who then appointed Stevenson ambassador to the United Nations. There's a college named after him at the University of California, Santa Cruz. I have a pretty nice coffee mug with his face on it. They referred to him as the Egghead. Stevenson comes up in the writings of all sorts of people, not just because of Santa Cruz, but probably that helps. The Simpsons episode, Lisa the Iconoclast and the Secret War of Lisa Simpson, appear with a film strip quoting Stevenson. In Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, President Merkin Muffley, played by Peter Sellers, was modeled on Adlai Stevenson. Stevenson's "Don't wait for the translation" speech to Russian ambassador Valerian Zorin during the Cuban Missile Crisis inspired dialogue in the courtroom scene for Star Trek IV: The Undiscovered Country. The historical speech itself is depicted in the 2000 film 13 Days, with Michael Fairman playing Stevenson. Stevenson's also referred to in Wayne's World 2, where they play at the Stevenson Park. Woody Allen's Annie Hall. Woody Allen's character tells a stand-up joke about the Stevenson-Eisenhower campaign. It's weird a guy who lost the presidential election twice 70 years ago is still so dang influential. And maybe that's a big thing about this agent of change. Are they really free if everything is programming? Who taught you Kung Fu? Whom? Clearly, there is a difference. If we're all being programmed, if they started testing you without the laugh track, that should tell you something. That everyone seems to be closer and closer programmed to respond to the same impulses in the same predictable ways. And so it's interesting that originally the threat wasn't even communism itself. Communism was a caveat of a multi-stage plan of Fabian socialism to eventually take over the world and put it right back into feudalism, which is really, come on, the oldest thing. Whereas some of these people were literally just talking about automation. Some of the first people to be blacklisted, for instance, were Charlie Chaplin, who made a movie about the world's greatest dictator.
Strange. These strike leaders, they're all brunettes. Not a blonde amongst them.
Brunettes are troublemakers. They're worse than the Jews.
Then wipe them out.
They will worship you as a god.
No, you mustn't say it. You make me afraid of myself. Leave me. I want to be alone.
He also talked a lot about the world in automation.
Section 5, speed her up, 4-1. Attention foreman. Someone on bench 5, check on the nut tightness. Nuts coming to loose on bench 5, attention foreman.
Impregnating and being forced to marry a 16-year-old American girl, and nearly getting shot by William Randolph Hearst on his boat when attempting to have an affair with his mistress. Another Hollywood producer was shot instead, and for this, Charlie Chaplin's life was spared. His career nor his reputation ever recovered again. Leonard Bernstein was an American composer, conductor, author, music lecturer, and pianist, and was one of the first conductors born and educated in the United States to receive worldwide acclaim. He's considered one of the most prodigiously talented and successful musicians in American history, and for his interest in socialism, being from New York, and for his interest in economic theory, he was blacklisted. He produced tons of amazing material, but perhaps nothing matched his critical success of West Side Story. His first opera, The Trouble in Tahiti, was dedicated to Blitzstein and has a strong social theme, criticizing American civilization and suburban upper-class life in particular. In 1970, Bernstein and his wife held an event to seek awareness and raise money for the Black Panther Party, and continued to sway the popularization of radical chic. This guy made it look cool. Another person who was labeled a communist, and I'm slightly skeptical that he wanted anything other than to eat plantains and pork in Brazil, and the only silver he ever needed would be on cellulose. Orson Welles had created the masterpiece Citizen Kane, attacking William Randolph Hearst and all that he represented within the American ruling elite. Citizen Kane brought down the wrath of a powerful, whole worldwide powerful network of what was called at the time Red Baiters, including the FBI, the Dies Committee, and the American Legion, all of which were allied and supported by the vociferously anti-communist publisher. The FBI opened a file on Welles in April 1941, shortly before Citizen Kane's release, and kept it active until 1956, when the filmmaker was safely semi-exiled in Europe. William Randolph Hearst had been an ally and collaborator of J. Edgar Hoover since the early 1930s, supplying him with information on suspected communists and fellow travelers in Hollywood. The FBI's report concludes about Welles' extraordinary first film. The evidence before us leads inevitably to the conclusion that the film Citizen Kane is nothing more than the extension of a Communist Party's campaign to smear one of its most effective and consistent opponents in the United States, i.e., Hearst. The hostility of Hoover and the FBI towards Wells was so great that although the Bureau's agents could find no proof of his membership in any communist or socialist-aligned party, and it appears he never was a member, the Los Angeles special agents in charge, R.B. Wood, took the drastic steps of recommending to Hoover in 1944 that Wells be listed as a communist on the FBI's security index. That little-known roster gathered the names of people who supposedly represented threats to national security. Originally, the Custodial Detention Index, it was designed by Hoover to facilitate the rounding up and detention of alleged subversives during the national emergency. Wells' name was also on the security index from 1945 to 1949. Wells may be a beneficiary of the changing times. In the 1970s, when the blacklisted people started getting a lot of attention, they are now seen as heroes. The whole thing reversed itself. With Wells, people have mistakenly rejected the idea but there were so many people who were gray-listed and blacklisted that you don't really know about, and that's part of the Kafkaesque nature of the blacklist. Sometimes, people could not even tell what happened to their careers because suddenly they just couldn't work. Another alleged communist was Lucille Ball. When Ball registered to vote in 1936, she listed her party affiliation as communist. She was registered as a communist in 1938 as well. To sponsor the Communist Party's 1936 candidate for the California State Assembly's 57th District, Ball signed a certificate stating, "I am registered as affiliated with the Communist Party." The same year, she was appointed to the State Central Committee of the Communist Party of California, according to the records of the California Secretary of State. In 1937, Hollywood writer Rena Valle, a self-identified former communist, attended a Communist Party new members class at Ball's home. According to Valle, testimonies before the United States House of Representatives Special House Un-American Activities Committee on July 22, 1940. 2 years later, Valle affirmed the testimony in a sworn deposition. Within a few days after my third application to join the Communist Party was made, I received a notice to attend a meeting on North Ogden Drive, Hollywood. Although it was a typed, unsigned note, merely requesting my presence at the address at 8 o'clock in the evening on the given day, I knew it was the long-awaited notice to attend Communist Party new members classes. On the arrival at this address, I found several others present. An elderly man informed us that we were the guests of the screen actress, Lucille Ball, and showed us various pictures, books, and other objects to establish the fact, and stated that she was glad to loan her home for a Communist Party new members class. In a 1944 British Pathé newsreel titled Fundraising for Roosevelt, Ball was featured prominently among several stage and film actors in support of Franklin D. Roosevelt during his fundraising campaign for the March of Dimes. Lucille Ball stated that in the 1952 U.S. presidential election, she voted for Republican Dwight Eisenhower. She stated that she had also registered to vote as a communist or intended to vote as a Communist Party ticket in 1936 at her socialist grandfather's insistence. She stated that she at no time intended to vote as a communist. Lucille Ball stated that she had never been a member of the Communist Party. To her knowledge, she did not know whether or not any meetings were ever held at her home at 1344 North Ogden Drive, stated that if she had been appointed as a delegate to the State Central Committee of the Communist Party of California in 1936, it was done without her knowledge or consent. And she stated that she did not recall signing the document sponsoring Emil Fried for the Communist Party nomination to the office of Member of the Assembly for the 57th District. According to the session on Un-American Activities, a review of the subject's file reflects no activity that would warrant her inclusion on the security index. Lucille Ball is an interesting case. Her father died of typhoid when she was only 3, and at 7, her mother remarried a Shriner. On July 4th, 1927, at 16 years old, Lucille Ball's life would change irrevocably in an instant. On that day, Ball's grandfather, who was a registered communist, was teaching her brother how to use the gun he'd just purchased for him, after meticulously setting up a tin can target in the backyard. It was a birthday present for Ball's brother, Freddie. Sadly, when a friend of her brother's was aiming at the target, Ball's 8-year-old neighbor accidentally wound up in the path of the bullet, and while he didn't die, the bullet severed his spinal cord, paralyzing him for life. The boy's father later sued Ball's grandfather for everything he was worth. They took their house, their furnishings, the insurance, everything. And Lucille's grandfather never worked again. It was through the Shriners vaudeville that she eventually found her way to Hollywood. Another thing that Lucille Ball said was that her husband, Xirtus, frightened her. They met in the studio in 1940 and he asked for a date every night, until eventually they were married. The Cuban son of Spanish plantation-owning noblemen, who himself had cleaned parakeet cages in Florida once he'd first arrived on the shores after losing everything to the communist coup in Cuba. Xirtus was not a Cuban nationalist communist, far from it. In fact, he was a free agent or agent of change. It is noted that Desi Arnaz was a fervent anti-Castroite who contributed to the ransom organized by RFK to organize the release of the Bay of Pigs prisoners. There's also interesting connections between Arnaz and some of the suspects in the JFK assassination case.
You know what Mrs. Quayle said on their wedding night? You're no John Kennedy. The mafia is bordered on one side by the Vatican and on the other side by the CIA. It is hard to tell at this point in history where the mafia leaves off and the Vatican begins on one side, or on the other side where the mafia leaves off and the CIA begins. A few years ago in Miami, Florida, the Dade County District Attorney indicted all the officers of a bank called the World Finance Corporation. He charged that they were knowingly, not accidentally, or while their backs were turned, or while they were in the John jacking off or anything like that, but knowingly and deliberately running the biggest cocaine money laundromat ever uncovered in legal history. The World Finance Corporation, the DA claimed, was not just a bank that occasionally laundered cocaine money, it was a bank set up deliberately to launder cocaine money, and everything else was side interest. He claimed all of the major cocaine suppliers in South America were using the World Finance Corporation to launder their money. The DA managed to convict 4 executives of the bank. He charged that the CIA interfered with his investigation and prevented him from fully exploring the background of 8 other officers of the bank. More water. All 8 of whom were former members of the CIA. What does former member of the CIA mean? There is the literalist interpretation, and in Berkeley you've all read Idries Shah, and you know you should never trust the literalist interpretation of anything. The literalist interpretation is a former CIA agent is somebody who's quit the agency and has no contact with them anymore. And then there's the esoteric interpretation, or the allegorical interpretation, which is that a former CIA agent is somebody who's been assigned to something so dirty the agency doesn't want it traced back to them. And so he's officially not on the books anymore, but he's being paid through a numbered bank account in Switzerland. Well, anyway, these 8 were former CIA agents. The president of the bank was named Hernandez Cataya, who was a CIA agent involved in the Bay of Pigs invasion. The World Finance Corporation, according to the evidence developed by the Dade County District Attorney and presented to the grand jury of Dade County, was sending all the cocaine money to the Cisalpine Bank in the Bahamas. The Cisalpine Bank in the Bahamas was jointly owned by Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, who was the manager of the Vatican Bank, and as a matter of fact still is the manager of the Vatican Bank. And the co-owner was Roberto Calvi, who was the president of Banco Ambrosiano in Milan. Now, I don't want to make this too complicated. We'll try to keep it simple. Marcinkus and Calvi, 2 simple names. Marcinkus, the Vatican Bank; Calvi, the Banco Ambrosiano. Calvi was indicted for laundering heroin money for the Gray Wolves. The Gray Wolves are a fascinating example of domesticated primate psychology. We got a lot of equivalents of them in this country. They are Islamic fundamentalists. They believe that Allah is the real name of God. I know a lot of you here have heard the real name of God is Jehovah, but that was invented by a German scholar in the 19th century who didn't know how to read Hebrew. According to the Jews, the real name of God is Yahweh, but you shouldn't say it aloud because you might get struck by lightning. Nothing happened. But according to the Arabs, the real name is Allah. And the Gray Wolves are on intimate speaking terms with Allah, and Allah has a real hard-on against Israel. Allah believes that Israel should be wiped off the face of the earth. And the Gray Wolves are trying to carry out the will of Allah, which isn't easy because Israel is getting such heavy support from the United States and has the best military machine in the Near East and has lots of money. And so the gray wolves, to do the will of Allah, have to raise money of their own, one way or another, to carry on the battle against Israel. And so they engage in selling heroin. Well, why not? If it's the will of Allah, the end justifies the means, right? Of course, you can make a lot of money out of heroin, but occasionally you got to go in for sidelines if you need a lot of money quick. So the gray wolves also farm themselves out as assassins for anybody who wants to hire an assassin. Well, if it's the will of God, there can't be anything wrong with it. They also run guns for other terrorists. They've been connected with the PLO and the IRA and the whole alphabet soup of terrorist groups in Europe. One of the gray wolves tried to shoot the Pope a couple of years ago, Mehmet Ali Agca. But anyway, the gray wolves run heroin, and some of the heroin was going through Banco Ambrosiano, run by Calvi. Calvi was also accused of embezzling funds from his own bank and knowingly receiving for deposit counterfeit stocks. The counterfeit stocks came in several batches, but the biggest batch was $1 billion in counterfeit stocks printed by the Johnny Roselli mafia family in Las Vegas. As a gunman for Al Capone in Chicago in the 1920s. And at the end of his career, he had risen to the level where he controlled the whole mafia organization throughout the state of Nevada. In 1961 and 62, he was working for the CIA, like many person in need of funds has found themselves working for the CIA. Johnny Roselli was hired by the CIA to arrange the assassination of Fidel Castro. Now, some of the things you read about the mafia in my books, among others, give you the impression they're infallible. No man can escape the mafia. Well, apparently, like a lot of other highly advertised organizations, they don't live up to their reputation because they tried 8 times to kill Fidel Castro, and unless the Cubans have some actor with a fake beard, they failed every time. Roselli told Jack Anderson that he was not involved in the Kennedy assassination when Anderson asked him directly, but Roselli said he knew which mafia family did do the job. Roselli was called to testify before the House Select Committee on Assassinations. He testified inconclusively. They then subpoenaed him to come back and testify again, and then he was shot. Oh, well, people get shot every day. According to Roselli's testimony to Anderson and to Congress, one of the main organizers of the Kennedy assassination was Sam Giancana in Chicago, the head of the mafia in Chicago. Sam Giancana had a particular grudge against Kennedy because he was largely responsible for Kennedy winning in 1960. 1960 was one of the closest races in American political history, and the reason Kennedy won instead of Nixon, the reason we didn't have Nixon 8 years earlier, Sam Giancana delivered Chicago to Kennedy. That was a deal that was worked out by Frank Sinatra. Isn't that amazing? This whole feud between you and the Kennedys, it can be ended. Let me make peace. And he arranged a meeting between John Kennedy and Sam Giancana, and Sam Giancana agreed to deliver Chicago, and Kennedy agreed to lay off on the mafia. At the time, Pope John Paul I read the stuff that Pecorelli sent him. He was so incensed, electrified, galvanized, and pissed off in general that he ordered Cardinal Vio to do an extensive investigation of the extent to which P2 was using the Vatican Bank for criminal purposes. The night that the Pope ordered that investigation, he was taken suddenly dead. They would not let any journalist see the death certificate, and they did not allow an autopsy. Nino Pecorelli, however, the guy who sent the Pope this inflammatory material about P2 and the Vatican Bank, we know what happened to Nino Pecorelli. He was shot dead on the streets of Rome. He was shot through the mouth. The mafia calls that sasso in bocca. That's the traditional mafia punishment for informers. Strangely enough, it happened to Sam Giancana, too. Do you remember Sam Giancana? Yeah. He was the guy who delivered Chicago to Kennedy and got pissed off because Kennedy did not lay off the mafia after that. Giancana was shot through the mouth, too. So was George D. Morgenschild, who was a close friend of Lee Harvey Oswald in Fort Worth and Dallas, who was suspected of being a CIA agent by a lot of conspiracy buffs around the country and private conspiracy investigators. When the Morgenschild was subpoenaed by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, he was found dead, shot through the mouth, too. That was ruled suicide. The mafia is bordered on one side by the Vatican and on the other side by the CIA. It is hard to tell at this point in history where the mafia leaves off and the Vatican begins on one side, or on the other side where the mafia leaves off and the CIA begins.
Arnaz attended St. Patrick's High School in Palm Beach. One of his classmates and friends was Sonny Capone, the son of Al Capone. And whatever else can be said about the mafia, they did send their kids to good Catholic schools. Arnaz received a call from his high school buddy the same day it hit the press that Arnaz had purchased the rights to a book by Oscar Freire called The Untouchables. As you may know, the book detailed Eliot Ness's fight against Al Capone, the leader of the Chicago Mafia called The Outfit. Capone's widow filed a multi-million-dollar libel suit against Arnaz, but lost. In New York, there were demonstrations outside the ABC studios, and longshoremen refused to unload Liggett and Myers cigarettes until the firm withdrew a sponsor of the show, which made its debut in the fall of 1959. The Cuban Triad, as well as the Sicilian Mafia in New York and Cosa Nostra in Chicago, as well as the multi-million-dollar Las Vegas gambling and entertainment lobby, and much of Hollywood, affected the course of the 1959 Democratic primaries leading up to the 1960 election of John F. Kennedy. According to the published reports, Capone's widow asked Sam Giancana for help. Giancana contacted his friend Frank Sinatra, who paid a post-midnight visit to Arnaz in Indian Wells, California. The conversation became so heated that it almost came to fisticuffs, but Sinatra made no progress with Arnaz. Unsatisfied, Giancana ordered a hit on Arnaz. According to the book The Last Mafioso by Jimmy Fraziano, that he had contacted Bomp, a San Diego hitman named Frank Bompensiero, to place a contract on Arnaz. Fraziano records Rosselli's complaints about the show. Millions of people see the show every freaking week. It's even popular in Italy. And what they see is a bunch of Italian lunatics running around with machine guns, talking out of the corner of their mouths, slopping up spaghetti like a bunch of freaking pigs. They make Capone and Nitti look like bloodthirsty maniacs. The guys that write this stuff don't know the first thing about the way things were in those days. Eliot Ness might took us. The tax boys got Al, not Ness. And what did he ever have to do with Frank Nitti? The Bomp, however, knew that Giancana was mercurial and that his tantrum against Arnaz might cool. According to some sources, however, it was Capone's widow who intervened and vetoed the hit. According to Fradiano, Desi Arnaz never knew how close he came to getting clipped. Another important blacklisted celebrity who was actually black himself, Paul Robinson, an American bass baritone concert artist and stage and film actor who became famous both for his cultural accomplishments and for his political activism. Paul studied at Rutgers College and Columbia University, where he was also a star athlete in his youth. He'd also studied Swahili and linguistics at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London in 1934. His political activities began with his involvement with unemployment workers and anti-imperialist students whom he'd met in Britain, and continued with support for the Loyalist cause in the Spanish Civil War, his opposition to fascism. In the United States, he also became active in the civil rights movement and other social justice campaigns. His sympathies for the Soviet Union and for communism, and his criticism of the United States government and its foreign policies caused him to be blacklisted during the McCarthy era. Returning from the Spanish Civil War to the United States in 1939 during World War II, Robson supported the American and Allied war efforts. However, his history of supporting civil rights causes and pro-Soviet policies brought scrutiny from the FBI. After the war ended, the CAA was placed on the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations, and Robson was investigated, and Robson was placed on the index. Due to his decision not to recant his public advocacy, he was denied a passport by the United States State Department, and his income consequently plummeted. He moved to Harlem. From 1950 to 1955, published a periodical called Freedom, which was critical of the United States policies. His right to travel was eventually restored as a result of the 1958 United States Supreme Court decision Kent versus Duels. In the early 1960s, he retired and lived the remaining years of his life privately in Philadelphia. Robson participated in benefit concerts on behalf of the war efforts and at a concert at the Polo Grounds. He met two emissaries from the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, Solomon Michaels and Isaac Pfeffer. Subsequently, Robeson reprised his role of Othello. In 1946, he met with President Truman and admonished Truman by stating that if he did not enact legislation to end lynching, the Negroes would defend themselves. Truman immediately terminated the meeting and declared the time was not right to propose anti-lynching legislation. About this time, Robeson's belief that trade unionism was crucial to civil rights and became a mainstay of his political beliefs as he became a proponent of the union activist Revel Cayton. Robeson was later called before the Tenney Committee, where he responded to questions about his affiliation with the Communist Party USA by testifying that he was not a member of the CPUSA. Nevertheless, the two organizations with which Robeson was initially intimately involved, the Civil Rights Congress and the CAA, were placed on the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations. In 1948, Robeson was a preeminent in Henry A. Wallace's bid for the President of the United States of America, during which Robeson traveled to the Deep South, at risk to his own life, to campaign for him. In the ensuing years, Robeson was forced to go overseas to work because his concert performances were canceled at the FBI's behest. While on tour, he spoke at the World Peace Council, at which his speech was publicly reported as equating America with a fascist state. Robeson refused to bow to the public criticism when he was advocated in favor of 12 defendants, including his longtime friend Benjamin J. Davis Jr., charged during the Smith Act trials of Communist Party leaders. Instead of rejecting, Robeson traveled to Moscow in June and tried to find Isaac Pfeffer. He let Soviet authorities know he wanted to see him. Reluctant to lose Robeson as a propagandist for the Soviet Union, the Soviets brought Pfeffer from prison to see him. Pfeffer told him that Mikkels had been murdered and that he would be summarily executed. To protect the Soviet Union's reputation and to keep the right wing of the United States from gaining the moral high ground, Robeson denied that any persecution existed in the Soviet Union and kept the meeting secret for the rest of his life except from his son. On June 20th, 1949, Robeson spoke at the Paris Peace Congress, saying that we in America do not forget that it was on the backs of the white workers from Europe and the backs of the millions of blacks that the wealth of America was built, and we are resolved to share it equally. We reject any hysterical ravings that urge us to make war on anyone. Our will to fight for peace is strong. We shall not make war on anyone. We shall not make war on the Soviet Union. We oppose those who wish to build an imperialist Germany and to establish fascism in Greece. We wish peace with Franco's Spain despite her fascism. We shall support peace and friendship amongst all nations, with Soviet Russia and the People's Republics. He was blacklisted for saying this in the mainstream press of the United States, including in many periodicals of the Negro press, such as The Crisis. In order to isolate Robeson politically, the House Un-American Activities Committee subpoenaed Jackie Robinson to comment on Robeson's Paris speech. Robinson testified that Robeson's statements, if accurately reported, were silly. Days later, the announcement of the concert headlined by Robeson in New York City provoked the local press to decry the use of their community to support subversives. When Robeson met the State Department officials and asked why he was denied a passport, he was told that his frequent criticism of the treatment of blacks in the United States should not be aired in foreign countries. On December 17, 1951, Robeson presented the United Nations an anti-lynching petition titled "We Charge Genocide." The document asserted that the United States federal government, by its failure to act against lynching in the United States, was guilty of genocide under Article 2 of the United Nations Genocide Convention. In 1952, Robeson was awarded the International Stalin Prize by the Soviet Union. Unable to travel to Moscow, he accepted the award in New York. Shortly after Stalin's death, Robeson penned "To You, My Beloved Comrade," praising Stalin as dedicated to peace and as a guide to the world. Through his deep humanity, by his wise understanding, he leaves us a rich monumental heritage. Robeson's opinions about the Soviet Union kept his passport out of reach and stopped his return to the entertainment industry and the civil rights movement. In his opinion, the Soviet Union was the guarantor of political balance in the world. In 1956, when Robeson was called before the hearings on Un-American Activities, after he refused to sign an affidavit affirming that he was not a communist, in his testimony he invoked the Fifth Amendment and refused to reveal his political affiliations. When asked why he had not remained in the Soviet Union because of his affinity with its political ideology, he replied, "Because my father was a slave and my people died to build the United States, and I'm going to stay here and have a part of it just like you, and no fascist-minded people will drive me from it." At the hearing, Robeson stated, "Whether or not I am a communist is irrelevant. The question is whether American citizens, regardless of their political beliefs or sympathies, may enjoy their constitutional rights." In 1957, still unable to accept invitation to perform abroad, Paul Robeson sang for audiences in London where 1,000 concert tickets for his telephone concert at St. Pancras Town Hall sold out within an hour, and also in Wales via the transatlantic telephone cable TAT1. In some ways, this was the first independent broadcast. Also, Langston Hughes, involved in several communist-supported groups and activities, but was never actually a party member. According to him anyway. Obviously, HUAC felt otherwise. Because the Communist Party of the United States often used his poetry in their newspapers, because Hughes had expressed interest in Marxist ideas in the 1930s, he was called to testify in 1953. He refused to give up any names, but freely answered all questions around his own writing and political views. He said that he never joined the Communist Party because it was based on strict discipline and the acceptance of directives that I, as a writer, did not wish to accept. After the hearing, he began to distance himself from some of his more radical poetry. Folk singer Pete Seeger was a member of both the Young Communist League and the Communist Party of America and made no bones about it. My father, Charles Seeger, got me into the communist movement, he said, but later apologized for following the party line so slavishly, for not seeing that Stalin was a supremely cruel misleader. When he was called to testify in front of the HUAC in 1955, Seeger refused to plead the fifth, but also refused to name any names. He was held in contempt of Congress and was sentenced to serve 10 years in jail for it, but the conviction was overturned. Zero Mostel from The Fiddler on the Roof was also named amongst the suspected Communist Party members in 1952, although he didn't appear before HUAC until 1955. Still, the accusation was enough to kill his career. When he finally got to testify, Mostel took the opportunity to exercise the comedic chops which he'd been in hibernation since the public accusation. When the committee's counsel asked, "Mr. Mostel, are you or are you not a communist?" he leapt out of his chair and acted like he was grabbing for the attorney's throat, yelling, "That man called me a communist!" He pretty much owned the trial after that, mocking the counsel and indirectly refusing to name names. Directly refusing to name names would have landed him a jail sentence like Pete Seeger's. Needless to say, this didn't win them over, and he remained blacklisted. By this point, it was becoming quite convoluted. You could see how some people had become socialists because of their grandparents or poetry, and had very little idea about the true reality of things, let alone Stalin. That's another important thing to remember. At this point, there is a giant experiment taking place, which is taking the name of communism and using that as an excuse for all of its misdoings. Not too different from how the American dream was being used in order to excuse and camouflage potentially what might be considered as war crimes. This has very little to do with poetry, and a lot more to do with economic agenda of managerial theory. Redistribution of the wealth is an authoritarian claim. Communism is the ultimate form of democracy. It is economic democracy. Democracy, where self-determination is expended for a social contract where the minority must submit to the majority. In communism, the democracy is slightly further, in that even the choices of the individual are owned and redistributed by the state, each according to their own needs, according to the state's preference. You see, this is a more abstract ideological concept where, no matter how much managerial theory is done, redistribution will always be the goal. As Brezhnevinsky describes it, is an era that involves the gradual appearance of a more controlled society. Such a society would be dominated by an elite, unrestrained by traditional values. Soon it would be possible to assert almost continuous surveillance over every citizen and maintain up-to-date complete files containing even the most personal information about the citizen. These files will be subject to instantaneous retrieval by the authorities. Suicidal statecraft is the ultimate cause of the imperial collapse. There are major disappointments with the outcomes of solidarity, corruption, and major pockets of economic backwardness, and even poverty. If there were a choice between the life Poles led in the 1970s, a choice between life today and a life 100 years ago, nobody but a lunatic would say they wanted to live back then the way they had before. Shortly, the public will be unable to reason or think for themselves. They'll only be able to parrot the information they've been given through the previous night's news. Speaking of a future, at most only decades away, an experimenter in intelligence control asserted, "I foresee a time when we shall have the means and therefore inevitably the temptation to manipulate the behavior and intellectual functioning of all people through environmental and biochemical manipulation of the brain. Today it is infinitely easier to kill 1 million people than to control 1 million people. People, governments, and economies of all nations must serve the needs of the multinational banks and corporations. We have a large public that is very ignorant about public affairs and very susceptible to simplistic slogans by candidates who appear out of nowhere, have no track record, but mouth appealing slogans. Technology will make available to the leaders of major nations techniques for conducting secret warfare, of which only a bare minimum of the security forces need to be appraised. Techniques of weather modification that could be employed to produce prolonged periods of drought or storm. Persisting social crisis, the emergence of a charismatic personality, and the exploitation of mass media to obtain the public confidence would be the stepping stones in the piecemeal transformation of the United States into a highly controlled society. This regionalization is in keeping with the trilateral plan, which calls for a gradual convergence of East and West, ultimately leading towards a goal of a one-world government. National sovereignty is no longer a viable concept. More directly linked to the impact of technology, today we are in a situation in which the free movement of people can have enormous, monumental dimensions. And I don't think that any country in Western Europe or America can any longer adopt the idea of totally free movement of people. It would simply overwhelm their social faculties, their societies, and create migratory dynamics on the scales of tens and tens of millions of people. That is simply not practical. No matter how deeply disturbing the thought of using the environment to manipulate behavior for national advantages might seem to some, the technology already exists. One thing we do know, things will become even more destabilized if we don't step up a Sino-US cooperation. In the technotronic society, the trend would seem to be towards the aggregation of the individual support of millions of uncoordinated citizens, easily within the reach of magnetic and attractive personalities, exploiting the latest communication techniques to manipulate emotions and control reason. The nation-state, as a fundamental unit of man's organized life, has ceased to be the principal creative force. International banks and multinational corporations are acting and planning in terms that are far in advance of the political concepts of the nation-state. In the long run, global politics are bound to become increasingly uncongenial to the concentration of hegemonic power in the hands of a single state. Hence, America is not only the first, as well as the only truly global superpower, but is also likely to be the very last. Zbigniew Brzezinski, 1970, Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technotronic Era. Brzezinski was the primary organizer of the Trilateral Commission and advisor to Jimmy Carter, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Obama. It's a must-read. Well, that's pretty interesting, right? Because then we're right back where we started with the McCarthy trial, in a time of delusion where we're not even sure if we can trust ourselves. I mean, after that, are you sure you're not a communist? It takes a while to know for sure you are or not. And that leads me into the television propaganda. There's a show called The Americans, which was out pretty recently, but I'm going to skip it and go to the original. There's a show I like to watch around the same time as Perry Mason called I Led Three Lives. From the personal files of FBI counterspy Herbert A. Philbrick, starring Richard Carlson. Richard Carlson from The Hemo the Magnificent, from Frank Capra's The Wonder of Science series, which we've shown before on Xirtus.
What's that gadget?
Well, this is called a drop sonde.
A drop what?
A drop sonde.
What's it for?
Well, it's dropped from an airplane, and it radios back pretty complete weather information to the mother plane.
Yeah, pretty neat.
Certainly is.
Sky waves and sky rivers. That come under prediction?
Yes, down toward the end, I think. About where the electronic weatherman is.
Quiet!
You dare thus address the weather deities, mortal?
Weather deities?
I am Meteora, supreme goddess of weather, and these are my attendant deities. Xirtus, the cloud god. Boreas, god of the winds. And the triplet gods, the Marutas.
I'm rain. I'm snow.
I'm hail.
Do you think this could be something I ate last night?
The show is an American drama series syndicated by Ziv Television Programs from October 1953 to January 1956. And the show was a sort of companion piece of sorts to the radio drama I Was a Communist for the FBI, which had been produced into a movie by Warner Brother Pictures, but is mostly remembered for the 78-episode radio show, if at all. The story follows Matt Chedick, who infiltrated the local Communist Party cell for 9 years and reported back to the Federal Bureau of Investigations. The film and radio show are in part artifacts from the McCarthy era, as well as a time capsule of America during the Second Red Scare. The purpose is both to partly warn people about the threat of the communist subversion of American society, but in a way also to hyper-dramatize the severity of the situation and distract, and through its dramatization, to make people take it less seriously. It was a favorite of Lee Harvey Oswald. I Led Three Lives told the story of another Bostonian, Herbert Philbrook, who infiltrated the U.S. Communist Party on behalf of the FBI in the 1940s. It was about his three covers as a citizen, a communist, and a counter-spy. Philbrook's outward life was as a white-collar worker. His secret socialist life was as a communist agent for Russia, and his arguably even more secret life as an FBI operative helping to foil the communist plots. I can see why Lee Harvey Oswald would just eat this up. I Led Three Lives lasted 117 episodes. Philbrook served as a technical consultant, with Carlson narrating each episode. The episodes often had very little to do with the actual events of Philbrook's life as related to the book. The screenplays gradually became more and more outlandish, featuring, for example, such supposed communist plots as the conversion of household vacuum cleaners into tactical missile launchers, with which, according to the show, the communists intended to destroy America's Nike anti-aircraft defense missiles, and ghost guns, untraceable firearms, with which the communists intended to assassinate their political enemies. All this, of course, before Nike shoes started actually using Vectran military-grade materials. All of this about American corporations working to use American consumer goods in order to corrupt American society, and eventually turn it into some sort of communist utopia. At the time, after all this, after Lucy Ball had been accused and Zero had made his jokes, communism seemed just starting to become silly, and it was hard to believe that anybody could seriously be a real communist, least of which in American business. And it was within 10 years of this that the entire Red Scare was done, that Kissinger had welcomed communist China, that Kissinger had advised Nixon to recognize the communist terrorists as the official government of China, and forevermore ceased recognizing Taiwan as a state like any other. Today, where American corporations like Disney have to bow down to serve the agendas of other states than the United One, primarily amongst them China. Today, the Nike plot of I Led Three Lives doesn't seem so silly. It seems pretty much like predictive programming, really. It's exactly what happened. But it wasn't just the communists, and I think that's really the relevant point of free agents and agents of change, that whatever organization that they might have ascribed to at a time, it's probably worth understanding what their motivations and goals were. And also by doing that, you become more like them themselves. Now, the original McCarthy scare didn't start with McCarthy. It actually goes back a bit further. The information that led to both anti-Zionism and anti-communism came from a more ambiguous-sounding group, one that today is probably more popular than taboo, the Illuminati. Myron Fagan, born in 1887, died in 1972, was an American writer, producer, and director for film and theater, and an essential Red Scare figure in the late 1940s and 1950s. Fagan was an ardent anti-communist, an influential relative communist relations theorist. Fagan produced many Broadway plays. Many of the actors Fagan directed, such as Humphrey Bogart, later became stars in Hollywood. In 1916, Fagan took a break from the theater to serve for the Republican presidential candidate, Charles Evan Hughes. When a similar offer was made in 1928 to him by Herbert Hoover, he turned it down. In 1929, the talking picture version of the play The Great Power earned the dubious record of being the shortest run of any movie at the Capitol Theater in New York. It was replaced with a silent comedy film after only one performance. In 1945, Fagan claimed he saw secret documents of the meetings in Yalta, shown to him by author John T. Flynn, that led him to write the plays Red Rainbow and The Thieves' Paradise. Red Rainbow portrays Roosevelt and Stalin and others in Yalta plotting to deceive the Balkans. Left-wing groups in New York opposed the production of the play, and Fagan had difficulties getting financial backing to produce it. Fagan took the play to Hollywood, where he encountered even more protests against it than in New York. In the 1940s, Fagan launched a one-man crusade against Hollywood, which he claimed was a red conspiracy. Out of the crusade would come the Cinema's Education Guild. In 1953, Red Rainbow was produced by Bruce Fagan and staged for 16 performances at the Royal Theatre. Within 2 years, Thieves' Paradise portrays the same group plotting to create the United Nations as a communist front for a one-world government. Fagan recorded records on the dangers and the organizational structure, even giving names of members of the Illuminati, as he referred to it. But those who realized their mistakes and left the front organizations in disgust and disillusionment are often still carried as subversives on Fagan's list. And therein lies the danger from any unofficial organization that undertakes a published list of alleged subversive organizations and individuals. They do not have the faculties, nor the authority, nor the experience to handle these matters in an expert fashion, and therefore they produce an enormous amount of harm. By falsely accusing individuals who are not only loyal, but have profited greatly by their unfortunate experience in having been lured into Communist Front groups. Subsequently, Myron Fagan recorded the LPs, 3 spoken word vinyls titled The Illuminati and the Council on Foreign Relations. These records presented the Bavarian Illuminati, the Protocols of Zion, and the international politics as faces of a single grand Luciferian, quote-unquote, conspiracy directed by the Rothschild family. The idea was that those who direct the overall conspiracy could use the differences in those two so-called ideologies, Marxism, fascism, socialism, versus democracy, capitalism, to enable them, the Illuminati, to divide larger and larger portions of the human race into opposing camps, so that they could be armed and then brainwashed into fighting and destroying each other. Yeah, and then that happened. And so in a lot of ways, of course, there's truth and lies and everything, but you can see how some of that might make a little bit of sense on the dollar. And also maybe it explains a bit about how there are free agents which can be picked up for operation. That is to say, we live in a world of change, a world of false scarcity where tech is the moneymaker, and control over destiny allows man to trade his hours away for whatever. This is an age-old plan, and there have been actors operating within this plan for centuries, and of course, over time, motivations and allegiances may have changed for some. There's an interesting correlation, of course, between the war we're having today with the East and West, and with the disputes we're having today between the East and the West, and those during the arrival of the Jesuits and the resurgence of Christianity in China in 1720. Christianity had first appeared in China in 635, but imperial hostility to the religion had forced it to disappear. Christianity only experienced a resurgence after the arrival of the Jesuits in the middle 15th century and their efforts to reintroduce the religion to the Chinese. This trilateralized organization, founded by a club from Rome, telling a story to the Chinese about an ancient Middle Eastern paradise and resurrection story. And similarly, with recruits of young boys trained and able to code switch, often made schizophrenic and psychically broken, in order to induce a hypno-schizophrenic multiple personality function. These persons could be anyone. They could be American citizens, they could be, and they might as well be.
Remember, only you can prevent forest fires.
But they could just as easily be anyone, and they could be from the bottom or the top of society, former criminals, former bankers, and why even former, let's just do this on their weekends. The Manchurian Candidate total recall of these schizo-American ultra soldiers is well known. Their abilities to recount in detail fantastic amounts of memory, yet often are cloudy around certain circumstances.
Cover every exit, and on no account let anyone leave the building. Now you two men go in the orchestra pit.
Ladies and gentlemen, we shall now sing.
Get out of my head. Now I know where I heard it before, of course. That music hall. Annabella's...
Ladies and gentlemen, with your kind attention and permission, I have now the honor to present to you one of the most remarkable men in the world.
It's the same little man.
Every day he commits to memory 50 new facts and remembers every one of them. Facts from history, from geography, from newspapers, from scientific textbooks, millions and millions of them, down to the smallest detail. Test him, ladies and gentlemen. Ask him any question.
I've got it. Of course there are no papers missing. All the information's inside Memory's head.
Mr. Memory.
But I still don't understand.
Don't you see? The details of that Air Minister secret were borrowed, memorized by this little man, and then replaced before anyone could find out. That's why he is here tonight. to take memory out of the country after the show.
But surely some gentlemen here would like to speak to you.
Often completely unaware of their triggers, yet capable of performing amazing deeds and tasks with grace and precision. Often somewhat insane, yet brilliant, these free agents often cannot remain in deep sleep, not for the many years, not for a lifetime after being trained, and these memories usually reemerge. Everyday people who don't really realize that they're being controlled or maneuvered, but perhaps ignorance is bliss.
What are the 39 steps? Come on, answer up! What are the 39 steps?
The 39 Steps is an organization of spies, collecting information on behalf of the Foreign Office of...
Keep your seats, please. There is no need for alarm, no cause for alarm.
I'm all right here. I don't want a chair, no. No,
All right, now,
no, let me rest here. I'm all
Take
right.
it easy, take it easy now. Take it easy.
Girls into doctor right away.
And knowledge is sorrow. And the best thing to do is to just go back to sleep.
Mr. Memory, what was the secret formula you were taking out of the country? Will it be all right me telling you, sir? It was a big job to learn it, the biggest job I ever tackled, and I don't want to throw it all away. It'll be quite all right. The first feature of the new engine is its greatly increased ratio of compression, represented by R minus 1 over R to the power of gamma, where R represents the ratio of compression, and gamma, seen in end elevation, the axis of the two-line of cylinder, angle of 65 degrees. Dimensions of cylinders as follows. This device renders the engine completely silent. Am I right, sir? Quite right, O'Shea. Thank you, sir. Thank you. I'm glad it's off my mind. At last.
But if we've done amazing things, and we can do amazing things again, all we have to do is to unlock it inside of ourselves. All of this programming is wet-wired, and now it seems more than ever, easier than ever, to get information, to harvest information, and to learn from it. You could easily be an agent of change yourself. You could easily be a free agent.
55 years. Not bad, Morty. You kind of wasted your 30s, though, with that whole bird-watching phase. Yeah, that's the difference between you and me, Morty. I never go back to the carpet store.
This guy's taking Roy off the grid. This guy doesn't have a social security number for Roy.
The question is not whether you're under mind control. It's whether or not you control your own mind. Because then you can unlock all the potential inside yourself to do exactly what you want to do, no more and no less. Conversely, you can avoid doing what you don't want to do. It seems like sometimes we're a little bit too afraid of our own powers. After all, if the story goes that they're using us as their most powerful weapons, then we really are the most powerful thing in the universe. So don't be part of some military dictatorship with bad CGI. Your mission, if you choose to accept it, is to put down the phone.
What's this? Is this the unnamed account in the Bahamas where the money was to be stashed? I think so.
I'm a Barbie girl in the Barbie world. Life in plastic is fantastic.
Xirtus.